A German shepherd lay trapped beneath the old steel trestle, her body bound in rough cords, a coarse sack pulled over her head. Beside her, a tiny pup shook with fear, pressed close against her ribs. Both were thin, bruised, their limbs trembling from the cold, abandoned in that desolate place with death closing in. The freight train roared ever nearer, the ground vibrating with its approach. Whoever had left them there never intended for anyone to see, never meant for their cries to be heard. But fate intervened. At that very instant, a figure stepped onto the bridge, Gideon Hale, a former U.S. Marine. He arrived at the precise moment when hope was nearly gone. What he chose to do would move you to tears and remind you that grace and second chances still exist. Before we dive into the story, tell me where you're watching from, drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no living being, human or animal, deserves to be abandoned, hit that subscribe button. Because this story, this one, may remind you that miracles still walk among us. The fog rolled down from the Blue Ridge Mountains like a gentle giant, brushing against the iron ribs of the bridge where the tracks crossed the French Broad River. The late afternoon sun in Asheville was little more than a pale coin, blurred behind a bank of gray cloud. The air was so sharp it stung the lungs, every breath visible like speech. Below, the river shifted with the sheen of hammered pewter. The steel rails above hummed faintly, an omen of the train that was testing the valleys with its weight. Gideon Hale walked the gravel path beside the line, moving with the quiet stride of a man who had spent years learning how to stay unseen. He was 36, tall and lean in a way that made jackets fall straight from his shoulders. His face was all strong edges, cheekbones cut high, a squared jaw, and eyes the color of deep well water. His hair was cropped close, no longer for regulation, but by long habit. A pale scar cut through one eyebrow like a crease in worn leather. He carried himself with a steadiness many mistook for distance. In truth, Gideon spoke little, but listened to everything. He had once been a Marine sergeant who could read the mood of a squad from a single boot print, and predict weather shifts from the feel of a rifle sling. He had also been a brother who missed family moments until absence piled up heavier than stone. In his shirt pocket rested an unopened envelope, the postmark from Tennessee. The handwriting was his sister's, delicate, as though she feared pressing too hard might break the words themselves. Gideon hadn't opened it. For 3 weeks he told himself he was waiting for a better time. For 3 weeks he believed that lie. Then it came, the sound that pulled him from his thoughts. A muffled, raw cry. Too sharp to be the wind, too desperate to be a bird. It came from beneath the trestle, from the bank where the gravel met the water, the very shape of suffering carried in that noise. Gideon halted, tilted his head, and let everything else fade. The hum of the rails grew louder. The steel sang in a pitch his bones remembered. Looking up the line, he saw through the tunnel of trees the distant bloom of light where the curve bent out of sight. Still far, but not far enough. He descended quickly, boots skidding on loose rock, the fog swallowing him like a curtain. The scent of wet iron, silt, and rope fibers rose sharp in his nose. At the narrow path where track and bank met, he found them. A German shepherd and her pup, wrapped in burlap sacks mottled with dirt and soaked through. Each sack was tied cruelly at the neck with coarse rope. The mother's knot sat tight behind her ears, choking with every breath. The pup's rope dug so harshly into his small throat it looked like it might crush him. Whoever tied them had shown neither care nor mercy. The mother's eyes, amber bright, struggled to stay calm, though her body shook uncontrollably. She was maybe 4, perhaps 5 years old, her frame drawn thin by neglect. Her coat was a mix of dusk and flame, with a small white blaze on her chest. One ear was bent from an old wound, another bore a ragged scar. Fear clung to her, mixed with the faint sweetness of milk. Even bound and gagged, she tried to twist her neck, shielding her pup from harm. The pup was barely 8 weeks, with paws too large for his frame and a dark mask across his muzzle. His body trembled at a pitch too high for such a small creature, the tremor of one who had met cruelty too soon. He gnawed helplessly at the rope, his baby teeth scratching uselessly, making only the faint squeal of glass rubbed against glass. The mother curled her leg protectively over him, then froze when Gideon appeared. A name rose in Gideon's mind without warning, Rhea. The mother was Rhea. The pup's name would come later. He crouched low, hands open, his voice pitched soft and steady, carrying reassurance without false promise. "Easy, Mama. You're not alone now." From his back pocket he drew a small utility knife. The blade snapped open with the crisp sound of a tool ready to work. The light from the tracks grew brighter, the rails vibrated beneath the gravel. Less than a minute now, his instincts told him. If it was the freight with double stacks, the bow wave would strike like a hammer. Gideon slid the knife under the rope at the pup's throat first. The fibers had bitten deep, leaving a swollen ring. With the blade's touch, the knot gave way. The pup wriggled, coughed a tiny cough, then pressed his muzzle into his mother's chest as if apologizing for surviving. Next Gideon cut the mother's rope, carefully angling the blade away from her skin. He tore at the burlap with his hands until the coarse threads burned his palms. Beneath the sack, her body bore old bruises and fresh scrapes, a map of neglect. Through it all, she kept her gaze fixed on Gideon, her pupils wide but unwavering. When the last rope fell free, she lifted her head, stretching her neck as though the very air were a collar she could finally escape. "Rhea," Gideon whispered, testing the name aloud. "We're standing up now." He slid an arm beneath her chest, feeling the frantic hammer of her heart, and scooped the pup against his ribs with the other. The little one smelled faintly of wet wool and pennies. As Gideon rose, the envelope in his pocket crinkled, a fragile reminder of another weight he still carried. Through the fog, a figure appeared on the opposite side of the track. A woman in a quilted coat, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, a canvas grocery bag bouncing against her hip. Mabel Ellison. She was the kind of neighbor Asheville was proud of, late 60s, sturdy, compassionate, with hands that had coaxed life from stubborn soil and nursed orphan creatures without complaint. Widowed too soon, Mabel had grown more inclined to show up rather than less. She wore her scarf thrifted, her boots practical, her expression the kind that cut through drama but never ignored emergency. "Gideon," she called softly into the mist. "Is that you down there?" "And two who need it more than me," he answered. "You have a blanket?" Mabel didn't hesitate. From her bag she pulled a wool throw, edges worn but sturdy, cinnamon brown with ribbon trim faded from age. She always kept it in her truck. Since the storm of '98, she said, fussing was wasted time. She came down briskly, smelling faintly of eucalyptus and laundry soap, eyes sharp but kind. In one glance, she took in Rhea and the pup from nose to tail, the kind of glance only rescuers understand. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered to the dog, not as a diminutive but as a blessing. Far down the line, the headlamp swelled in the fog, the train's song sharpening into a scream. "We climb, now," Gideon said. The ties were slick with dew, the ballast unsteady underfoot. Gideon shifted Rhea across his forearm, her body warm against the damp, tucked the pup into the front of his coat, and followed Mabel up the embankment. The German shepherd trembled, but Gideon's low murmur steadied her steps. At the rise, Mabel spread the blanket wide like a flag. Gideon lifted both dogs over, stumbling awkwardly, but survival never cared about grace. On the safe side, Mabel draped the blanket over Rhea's back, tucking it snug under her chest. The pup poked his head from Gideon's coat, squeaking his protest against the cold. The train's light was no longer a distant glow, it was upon them, burning through the fog. They scrambled down the far side of the slope into a patch of frozen grass just as the engine tore across the bridge. The sky split with thunder. Sparks burst along the rails, vanishing as quickly as stars. The ground shook beneath them, the fog whipping like a sail. Gideon folded himself over Rhea and the pup, shielding them with his body. In those endless seconds, the world shrank to wool against fur, breath against skin, the simple, urgent gift of survival. When the last car screamed past and the valley exhaled, the silence left behind felt like grace itself. Rhea, once a trembling question wrapped in rope, lifted her nose and touched Gideon's jaw. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. Rhea, he said again, softer this time. A name. A promise. The train's thunder faded into the night, leaving only the sharp smell of iron and smoke lingering in the fog. Gideon remained crouched, one arm still wrapped around Rhea, the other securing the pup against his chest. His breath came hard, steadying itself as silence finally reclaimed the valley. Beside him, Mabel knelt, her hands firm against the wool blanket to keep it from flying away. Her mouth was set, her eyes gleaming with the same bright alertness she had shown all her life. Gideon could feel Rhea's heartbeat, quick but no longer wild, shifting from panic to something steadier, almost deliberate. The pup nestled against his ribs, its tiny heart racing like a drum too small for its song. Gideon closed his eyes for a moment and let the warmth of the two lives in his arms press back the cold that seeped from the ground. When the rails fell silent and the last heat of the engine drifted away, the world felt smaller, safer. He loosened his arms but did not release them. The German shepherd, once nothing but a shivering bundle of fear, lifted her head and pressed the tip of her nose against his jawline. It was not surrender, not yet trust, but it carried the shape of both. Rhea, Gideon whispered, the name falling softer than before. Saying it felt like sealing a promise. Mabel straightened, her knees popping, her expression returning to its usual brightness as if to restore a sense of ordinary life. Well now, she said, voice steady. That was a closer shave than I ever care to see again. Let's get these two warmed up. I've got a thermos of tea in the truck, and a quilt in the back that isn't much to look at, but it's honest. She reached out, palm open, waiting for the shepherd's permission. When Rhea allowed it, Mabel stroked between her ears with the tenderness of someone who had soothed 100 wounded things before. Steam rose from the dog's damp fur, turning the blanket into a small glowing tent in the cold night. Gideon glanced down at the corner of the envelope still poking from his pocket, pale against his dark wool shirt. For a brief second, the weight of guilt and gratitude balanced evenly inside him. But he didn't open it. Not yet. The rails, having spoken their fury, lay quiet. The river kept its secrets. In the distance, the town exhaled, the faint sound of tires on wet roads, the jingle of a shop's doorbell, the distant heckle of a jay pretending to be a comedian in the pines. Gideon rose carefully, Rhea tucked against his arm, the pup squeaking from inside his coat as though objecting to the weather. Mabel gave him a nod, firm but warm. Come on, soldier, she said, not as a title but as an old habit of address, the way Southerners called strangers, darling, without meaning possession. Your place is closer than mine. We'll get them in out of the cold. He accepted the words without protest. Thank you for the blanket, he said, and his voice carried more weight than wool could ever bear. Together they crossed the short field toward Mabel's pickup, which crouched at the roadside like a loyal beast. Behind them, the bridge loomed the same as it always had, iron stitched into stone, a witness that asked no questions. Ahead, the night opened like a door no one remembered closing. Gideon held the pup closer, and beneath damp fur and threadbare wool he felt Rhea's heartbeat steady into something that sounded like survival. For now, that was enough. He would read his sister's letter. He would call her. He would wash and heal these two and make them a place by his fire. But first, he would simply hold them in the hush of the aftermath. The fog swirled in the wake of the departing train, and in that pocket of grass stood a man, a mother, and her child, 3 survivors caught in a fragile moment of grace. Then Gideon began to walk. At Gideon's cabin. The road to Gideon Hale's home wound like a ribbon of stone through the shadowed hills, slick with mist that clung to the ridges. His cabin stood at the edge of Biltmore Village, an A-frame structure with cedar boards weathered by years of wind and rain. Its roof cut sharply into the sky, while narrow windows glowed with warm lamplight. The porch sagged just enough to groan when crossed, and a wind chime of bent spoons sang whenever the mountain breeze shifted. In his arms, Gideon carried Rhea, her weight heavier than she was because of all she had endured. The pup, pressed close to his chest, squirmed and whined, his small tail wagging even in exhaustion. Mabel trudged beside him, her blanket folded neatly across her arm, her gray bun softened by the damp. When Gideon pushed open the cabin door, the smell of pine resin and smoke spilled out to greet them. Inside, walls of knotty wood glowed honey-colored in the firelight. The hearth still radiated warmth from a banked fire. The cabin air was thick with the kind of silence that promised shelter. Rhea balked at the threshold, paws splayed, her amber eyes darting warily into the shadows beyond. Gideon crouched low, murmuring reassurance until, finally, she pressed her muzzle into the crook of his arm and stepped forward. The pup, bright-eyed despite his ordeal, wagged his tail and squeaked as though urging her on. Minutes later, headlights swept briefly across the cabin wall. A car crunched into the drive. The door opened, and Dr. Karina Hole stepped in. She was in her mid-30s, auburn hair tied in a loose knot that was forever slipping strands free. Her clothes were practical, scrubs beneath a waxed canvas jacket, jeans tucked into boots scuffed by barn floors. Years of veterinary work had shaped her, giving her a calm steadiness lined with steel. Karina had grown up on a dairy farm outside Hendersonville, surrounded by the smells of hay and iodine. A barn accident had taken her father's life too early, and loss had driven her to heal creatures wherever she could. She had carried that purpose into every barn, clinic, and cabin she entered. She set her medical bag on the pine table with brisk certainty and knelt beside Rhea. The shepherd flinched when the zipper hissed open. Karina's voice dropped low, her hand resting gently against the blanket until Rhea's trembling eased. "Let's see what we have here," she murmured. Working quickly, she clipped away strands of burlap still clinging to fur, trimming where mud and blood had matted. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the cabin as she cleaned wounds. Rhea's skin twitched from the sting, but she never growled. The thick ridges around her neck told the story in angry red circles. "She's been tied like this more than once," Karina said, her voice steady but sad as she looked at Gideon. "Old scars under new ones. Someone tried to break her." Gideon's jaw clenched as he stroked Rhea's ear. He said nothing. Silence was his way of storing anger until it had use. Meanwhile, the pup had no patience for solemn work. Wriggling from Gideon's arm, he tottered across the cabin floor, paws too large for balance. His nose caught the scent of wool, and he discovered Gideon's old pair of socks rolled near the hearth. With the authority of a conqueror, he seized one, paraded across the floor with it dangling from his mouth, and dove beneath the rocking chair. Mabel laughed softly, gravel and music mixed together. Gideon surprised himself by smiling, the first real smile in years, tugging muscles he'd nearly forgotten. "First laugh I've heard from you since," Mabel began, then left the thought unfinished, her eyes warm instead of pressing. Karina leaned back, wiping her hands on a cloth. "The pup's resilient," she said, nodding toward him. "But she tilted her chin toward Rhea, "she'll need more than food and stitches. Trauma doesn't just live in the body. You'll need patience. She'll flinch at noises for months, maybe longer." As if to prove her point, the back door rattled with a gust of wind. Rhea shoved her muzzle into Gideon's arm, eyes squeezed tight. He steadied her with a slow hand, murmuring soft nonsense sounds, the same cadence he'd once used to calm rookies before a jump. Mabel busied herself at the stove, heating water until steam fogged the windows. She passed Gideon a warm towel with a half-smile. "Warm cloth works better than you think. Keeps the chill off the lungs." She tucked the blanket tighter around Rhea with hands practiced in the mercies of care. Karina set a line for fluids, explaining each step calmly. Rhea's eyes tracked her every move, suspicious but too weak to resist. As the drip began, color returned to her gums by slow degrees. The pup, having conquered the sock, curled beneath the chair, paws twitching in puppy dreams of grander victories. The hours stretched into night. Rain thickened against the roof. Gideon sat cross-legged on the floor, Rhea's head heavy on his thigh, her breathing finally even. The unopened envelope pressed against his chest from his pocket like a second heartbeat. He thought of opening it. But before he could, headlights swept the cabin wall again, slower, lingering. An engine rumbled low outside before cutting abruptly to silence. Mabel sat upright in her chair, her face sharpening with suspicion born of a lifetime of surviving on her own. "That's no neighbor," she whispered. Through the window, the faint glow of red tail light seeped into the fog, then vanished. Whoever had come was watching. Karina glanced at Gideon, her expression cautious, resolute. Rhea lifted her head, ears stiff, her body rigid. The pup gave a confused squeak, sensing fear in the room. Gideon rose, his shadow stretching against the wall, one hand brushing the envelope in his pocket as though it might anchor him. Mabel's voice was soft but firm. "Whoever tied those ropes isn't finished yet." The morning after the red truck haunted Gideon's yard, the mist finally lifted from the French Broad. A crisp autumn sky spread above, the air sharp with the scent of chimney smoke and damp leaves. Gideon stepped out of the cabin with Rhea at his heel. The pup bounded after him, tripping over his own paws with the clumsy joy of the young. Rhea looked healthier after a night's rest and fluids. Her body still carried the raw scars of rope and neglect, but her eyes glimmered faintly between suspicion and a cautious loyalty. Gideon crouched low and held out a strip of jerky. For a long moment, the German shepherd hesitated, muscles tense, amber eyes locked on his. Finally, she leaned forward and took it gently, her teeth brushing his calloused fingers. That one deliberate bite was a fragile truce, a first stone laid in the bridge of trust. On the porch, Mabel folded the cinnamon-colored blanket she had loaned the night before. Her frame, sturdy despite her years, seemed carved from the same grit as the mountain itself. Her hands, rough from mending and tending, paused as she studied Rhea. "She trusts you," Mabel said plainly. Then she added, "Trust is rarer than blood in this world. Don't squander it." She patted the porch railing as though reassuring the wood, then shuffled down the steps toward her cottage, her scarf trailing in the breeze. Later that morning, Gideon drove his dented Ford pickup into town. In the truck bed lay the burlap sack he had cut from Rhea's body, its faded green logo reading, Asheville Feed and Grain Supply Company. The fibers were stiff with mud, the logo still clear. He carried it into the feed store where Earl Jennings, the longtime owner, leaned across the counter. Earl was a broad man in his 60s, plaid shirt buttoned to the throat despite the warmth, his beard thick and stained from years of chewing tobacco. His gruffness masked a heart that cared deeply for animals and farmers alike. Earl eyed the sack, traced the logo with a thick finger, and muttered, "Yep. That's ours. Sold a stack just last week. Boys I didn't like the look of, loud, tattooed. Paid in cash. Didn't give names. But one had Crowder inked across his forearm, big as life. Couldn't miss it." The name sank heavy in Gideon's chest. The Crowder clan. Trouble wrapped in human skin. They had a reputation in these mountains, moonshine busts, livestock thefts, fights that ended with blood spilled in backwoods bars. The youngest, Silas Crowder, was the worst of them. A broad-shouldered man in his late 20s with slick-back black hair and a cruel scar running jagged near his mouth. He was known for treating dogs as commodities, bred for fighting, traded like tools. Gideon thanked Earl with a curt nod and carried the sack back out into the sunlight. It wasn't just evidence, it was a warning. Training and tentative peace. Back at the cabin, Rhea began halting steps toward recovery. Gideon used soft whistles and hand signals to coax her into simple commands: sit, stay, come. At first, she froze, ears pinned, eyes darting as though expecting punishment. But with each gentle call, each patient moment, she inched closer to remembering what trust felt like. The pup, however, had no such hesitations. He treated every command as a game, tumbling across the grass, ears flopping, his tail wagging furiously. Once, He snatched a stick nearly twice his size and proudly dragged it around the yard, until he tripped, rolled down the slope by the shed, and popped back up wagging harder than before. The sound of Gideon's laughter startled even himself. It bubbled up unbidden, rusty from disuse, but real. By Sunday evening, the town gathered at the church hall for a potluck. Folding tables bent under the weight of casseroles and pies. Children darted through the rafters, their shouts ringing like bells. Gideon stood near the back, nursing sweet tea, the picture of quiet solitude. Rhea lay curled at his boots, wary of the crowd but too tired to resist. The pup, restless as ever, roamed the hall like a bandit. When someone dropped a sausage link, he snatched it instantly and bolted beneath a long table, growling playfully as kids scrambled after him. The chase set the whole room laughing, even the stern deacon's wife wiping tears from her eyes. For a moment, Gideon felt the weight of tension lift, as though he were almost human again, part of a community he had long kept at arm's length. But peace, he knew, never lingered. The Crowders emerge. Monday afternoon, Gideon's unease returned. Driving past a shuttered hardware store, he slowed when he spotted two men leaning against a dented van in the gravel lot. Cigarettes burned in their hands, smoke curling lazily. Their jackets hung open despite the chill, exposing ink that climbed their arms. One tattoo caught Gideon's eye immediately, Crowder in thick block letters across the taller man's bicep. His face was sharp-jawed, pitted with old acne scars, his smile a cruel half-sneer. Beside him, the shorter man's eyes darted restlessly, his cheek chewed raw from nervous habit. Gideon parked at a distance, pretending to check his tire as he listened. "Need a bitch that's dropped pups already," the taller one muttered, voice low. "Crowder wants fresh stock, not worn-out ones." The other spat into the gravel, nodding. "He'll pay if she's strong. Knows how to fight." Their casual cruelty hung heavy in the air, coated in smoke. Gideon's hand clenched around the wrench he carried, his pulse thudding in his ears. He turned back to his truck, forcing himself calm. But before he could climb in, a shadow stepped out of the alley. Silas Crowder himself. He was larger than rumor suggested, his leather jacket stretched across thick arms. A crow tattoo coiled up his neck, peeking above the collar. His eyes were steel gray, flat and cold as stone. He leaned casually against Gideon's truck, close enough that the stink of oil and cigarettes clung to the air between them. His voice was low, deliberate. "Nice dog you got there, Marine." His lips curled into a mockery of a smile. "But she ain't yours. That one's ours. Been marked already." Gideon's jaw tightened. His reply was even, hard. "She belongs to no one but herself." Silas's smile vanished. He pulled a crumpled scrap of paper from his pocket, tucked it under Gideon's windshield wiper, and leaned close. "We'll talk tonight," he said, his tone dropping colder. "Don't keep what isn't yours." He tapped the hood once with his knuckles and walked off, his men's laughter trailing behind him. Gideon sat in the cab for a long moment, staring at the note. His breath came slow and deliberate, as if steadying for a fight he had hoped never to face again. In the back, Rhea shifted restlessly, her ears twitching at the tension. The pup whimpered softly, sensing the storm in the air. The sky, once bright, felt heavy now, thick with the promise of trouble. The fog clung stubbornly to the blue ridge the next morning, wrapping the valley in a dull gray that felt more like breath held than weather. Inside Gideon's cabin, the fire burned low, its crackle the only sound besides the slow rhythm of Rhea's breathing. She lay stretched across the rug, her sable coat marred by scars that told stories no animal should carry. Her chest rose and fell, but even in sleep her body stayed tense, as if rest was still a stranger. Karina knelt beside her again, stethoscope dangling against her scrub top. She parted Rhea's fur gently, her auburn hair slipping loose from its knot. Beneath the healed patches of coat she uncovered pale ridges, crisscrossing like a cruel map. "She's been through fights," Karina murmured, her voice low but firm. These aren't farm injuries. She's been forced into brutality. Likely bred until she was empty. The words were quiet, but hard as iron. Years of veterinary work had left Karina carrying these kinds of images like heavy stones. Gideon sat opposite her, one elbow braced on his knee, his eyes locked on the burns around the shepherd's neck. The thick rope scars cut into his own silence. They pulled at memories he had shoved deep beneath layers of discipline and time. Years ago, overseas, he had guarded a port where smuggling moved in cages stacked like cordwood. He'd watched handlers drag terrified animals from crates, sacks over their heads, ropes cutting flesh. He'd turned away then, obeying orders, leaving it for someone else to solve. Now, looking down at Rhea trembling at his feet, the weight of those failures pressed against his chest. His voice came rough, spoken more to himself than anyone. Not this time. I won't look away. Karina didn't answer with words. She simply watched him, her eyes steady, reading the conviction written in his posture. She closed her kit and touched Rhea's flank with a gentleness that carried both apology and respect. The letter. Later that afternoon, the small pile of mail sat untouched on Gideon's table. Bills, flyers, and one letter that had lived in his pocket since the rescue. The envelope was creased, the handwriting delicate and looping, his sister Sarah's. Sarah had always been the steady one, for years younger, auburn-haired like their mother, her face freckled from summers selling peaches by the roadside. Life had tested her early. Their father's death left her to shoulder the family while Gideon was overseas. She had grown into a woman of quiet resilience, now a nurse in Knoxville, married with a daughter of her own. He slit the envelope open with the edge of his pocketknife. Her words unfolded like a voice he had avoided hearing for too long. Lily turns 6 next month. She asks about her uncle more often than she should. I'd love for you to be here, even just for a day. We'll keep a chair waiting. The simplicity of it hit harder than any accusation could. Gideon exhaled slowly, pulled his old flip phone from his pocket, and typed with deliberate keystrokes. Tell her, I'm coming. Wait for me. Just not yet. He didn't send it to buy himself time, he sent it as a promise, one he knew he could not afford to break. Mabel's gift. Dusk brought a quiet knock at the door. Mabel Ellison entered, her stride unhurried, a small wooden box tucked beneath her arm. At 68, her frame was compact, her back bent slightly from years of tending gardens and carrying burdens no one else would. Her eyes, gray and sharp, carried laugh lines, but also the steel of someone who had survived grief. She set the box on Gideon's table, opened it, and revealed a small brass handbell. Its surface was dulled with age, the handle worn smooth by another man's grip. When she tilted it, the clapper chimed clear and bright. This belonged to my husband, Mabel said, her voice both tired and proud. He used it when his heart grew weak. Let me know he was still there. Saved him twice before the last time. Keep it close. When the fear presses, you ring it. Someone will hear. Someone will come. Gideon turned the bell in his hand, the weight strangely comforting. You're telling me to ring it when I'm afraid? Her lips bent into something between humor and sorrow. I'm telling you none of us gets through alone. Not even Marines. She left it in his hand, stepped back into the night, and closed the door softly behind her. The threat. The cabin was quiet again, the fire throwing long shadows across the cedar beams. Gideon tossed another log into the stove. Rhea stirred, ears pricking toward the door. Ren, who had been gnawing a scrap of kindling with the stubbornness of youth, froze. He dropped it and scrambled under the rocking chair, tail wagging nervously as his eyes widened. Gideon rose, instinct already humming like an old warning. He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. Twilight pressed heavy over the yard, mist curling along the fence line. On the cedar rail, something pale fluttered. He stepped closer, boots crunching gravel. A strip of paper had been pinned to the wood with the blade of a hunting knife. He pulled it free. The words, scrawled in jagged strokes, were blunt. Full moon. Return the bitch and the pup. Gideon's jaw locked. At his side, Rhea pressed close, her body tense, her ears forward. The low rumble in her chest was not rage but fear sharpened into vigilance. From under the chair inside, Ren's tail thumped faintly, but his wide eyes shone with panic too big for his small frame. Gideon folded the note carefully, slid it into his pocket beside his sister's letter, and closed the cabin door. The walls seemed closer now, the house smaller, as though danger itself pressed against the windows. But on the table the brass bell gleamed faintly, a promise in metal. He lifted it once, let it ring softly into the silence, and knew the sound meant more than just noise. It meant he was not alone. The mist never fully lifted that morning. It clung low to the French Broad, curling along the ridges as if the river itself carried secrets in its breath. Gideon stood on the porch of his cabin before dawn, the brass handbell Mabel had left him catching a faint glimmer of grey light. In his pocket, the Crowder's warning burned like a coal. Today was for preparation. He began with the windows. One by one, he fitted cedar planks across the inside frames, each hammer strike echoing through the woods. His motions were deliberate, the rhythm of a man who had built defenses before, though never in a place he dared to call home. By midday, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the quiet. Sheriff Thomas Whitaker stepped from his county cruiser, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He was in his early 40s, his frame solid from years of work, not vanity. His hazel eyes carried the wear of a man who'd seen too much cruelty in too small a county. His hair, dark blonde, was clipped neat, his leather duty belt scuffed from long service. "You've got reason to be uneasy," Whitaker said, adjusting his belt. "Heard whispers about the Crowder boys running dogs outside the county line. But I've only got 2 deputies for 20 miles of road. I'll check in when I can, but I can't promise more." Gideon nodded once, jaw tight. "I'm not asking for miracles, Sheriff. Just eyes on the road." The two men clasped hands briefly, the kind of promise made without words, then Whitaker left, his cruiser fading into the fog. Back inside, Gideon tied twine between the porch posts, threading small brass bells along the line. He strung more behind the cabin, fastening tin cans to the tree lean, every rattle, every chime meant warning. He carved a narrow escape path through the pines, leading down to a rocky outcrop by the river where brush grew thick enough to hide in. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. Karina's collar. Toward evening, Karina Hole arrived. Her auburn hair was tied back tighter this time, her eyes already scanning the tree lean as though expecting danger to leap from the mist itself. A small canvas bag hung from her shoulder. "I brought something," she said, crouching by Rhea. From the bag she drew a collar, broad, soft leather lined with fleece, dyed a gentle blue. "No more rope burns," she murmured as she buckled it gently around Rhea's neck. "This won't touch the scars." The shepherd leaned into her touch, still wary but no longer trembling. Karina's gaze softened. "Trust takes time. Let her set the pace." Gideon's throat tightened. He gave a single nod, words caught somewhere deeper than speech. Neighbors arrive. As dusk bled into night, another figure came up the path. Tom Garner, a farmer from 2 hollows over, carried a lantern in one hand and a bundle of tools in the other. Tall and lean, his face was creased from sun and work, his hands shaped by plow handles. He had known Gideon's father once, not closely but enough to respect the Hale name. "Heard you might need extra water barrels, nails, maybe some wire." "I've got more than I'll use. Just say the word." His tone was easy, but his eyes carried steel, the kind of resolve forged by men who had seen livestock stolen, land disputed, and neighbors left too alone. Gideon clasped his hand. "Keep that lantern high, Tom. I may take you up on it." The first night. Darkness settled heavy, the mist pressing low. Inside the cabin, Gideon cleared a corner of the living room and began what felt like drills. Sit. Wait. Stay, he said firmly, raising his hand in signal. Rhea obeyed, though her ears flicked at every creak of the stove. He rewarded her with a steady hand along her back. The pup, curious as ever, fumbled at first. Gideon crouched low, calling his name firmly, guiding him into the nook behind the woodpile. It became a game for the pup, but Gideon's tone carried gravity. Survival wrapped in play. Hours passed. The mist thickened, clinging to the eaves. Gideon sat on the porch with the lamp doused, the brass bell resting near his boot. Only the faint orange glow of embers lit the cabin behind him. Inside, Rhea breathed slow, Ren curled against her side. Karina sat nearby, a book open in her lap though unread. Mabel had gone home, but her presence lingered in the quiet chime of the bells strung along the rail. Then, metal on metal. A faint jingle from the backyard. Not the stove. Not the wind. One of the warning lines. Gideon stilled, every sense sharpening. Then came the crunch of boots on gravel. Deliberate. More than one set. Shapes moved at the edge of the mist, 5, maybe 6 figures shifting between trees. The bell on the porch trembled faintly as a heavy step vibrated the wood. Inside, Rhea had already risen. She padded silently to the door, planting herself squarely before it, her body rigid, ears forward. She did not growl, she simply waited. Ren whimpered once before Karina scooped him toward the hiding nook, whispering comfort. Gideon stepped out into the night, leaving the lights dark. The fog licked cold against his face. The figures halted at the edge of the yard, only half seen, their breath steaming into the gray. The smell of sweat and oil drifted sharp, and the faint scrape of metal against cloth carried through the mist. Gideon's voice was low, calm, honed with steel. Half a step closer, he said, boots planted wide. And you'll learn exactly who I am. The mist held its breath. The bells whispered softly in the breeze. Rhea stood beside him, unflinching, a sentinel carved of scar and sinew. Her new collar glowed faintly blue against the dark. Behind them, the cabin was sealed, escape path ready, the family inside safe. And the night waited. The bells on the porch rang again. Not softly this time, but sharp, snapped hard enough that Gideon knew it wasn't the wind. He motioned Karina back inside without a word. She caught Ren against her chest, the pup squirming in alarm, and slipped toward the hiding nook. Rhea stayed by Gideon's side, her hackles rising, her chest rumbling low like a storm building behind stone. From the tree lean, a voice floated through the fog. Mocking. Familiar. Thought you could keep what's ours, Marine. Silas Crowder stepped into the lantern's reach, his bulk towering, his leather jacket slick with mist. 2 of his men flanked him, shadows with knives glinting faintly in the haze. Another pair moved wide, circling toward the shed. Gideon's stance hardened. His voice came out steady, deliberate. She's not yours. Neither is the pup. Silas grinned, showing the scar cut jagged by his mouth. Everything in these hills is mine if I decide it is. He lifted a bottle in one hand. The rag stuffed in its mouth flickered with fire. Even your pretty little cabin. The bottle arced through the fog, flame trailing like a comet. Gideon moved instantly, catching it against the edge of his coat before it shattered. He flung it wide into the mud where it hissed out in steam. But 2 more bottles sailed after, crashing against the porch rail. Flames roared, licking the cedar, smoke rushing into the air. Karina coughed inside, her voice sharp with fear. Gideon. Out the back, he barked, already moving. Go. Now. The escape path waited. Karina clutched Ren tight and vanished through the rear door, Mabel guiding them with a lantern from the shadows. Rhea stayed planted beside Gideon, every line of her body declaring she would not retreat. The fire spread fast, boards crackling, embers spitting upward like sparks from a forge. The cabin, his one place of shelter, was being devoured in front of him. Silas stepped closer, his men tightening their circle. "Hand her over, and maybe I let the rest of you walk." Gideon's jaw locked. His eyes flicked once to the brass bell still hanging by the porch. Its last chime had already called what it needed to. He unhooked it with one hand, slipped it into his pocket beside his sister's letter, and whispered so only Rhea could hear. "With me." The chase. They broke from the cabin yard just as flames reached the roof. Rhea ran at Gideon's side, her paws striking earth like drums of war. Behind them, shouts rose, the Crowders in pursuit, boots pounding, dogs barking wild from the van. Gideon sprinted the escape path he had carved, weaving through pines, heart hammering with the weight of two promises, to his sister, and to the lives that trusted him now. The forest spat them out by the old tracks, steel rails gleaming faintly under moonlight. Smoke from the burning cabin drifted in the distance, carried by wind. And then, headlights. The red pickup. Its engine growled low as it rolled onto the cinder bed, blocking the crossing. Silas jumped down from the truck, his shadow long across the gravel. The crow tattoo on his neck gleamed with sweat. In his hand glinted a blade as crude as his grin. "No more running, soldier," Silas sneered. "She's marked. She belongs in the pit." Rhea pressed close to Gideon, trembling but standing tall. Her scars shone in the cold light, not as weakness, but as testimony. Gideon stepped forward, his body squaring like it had in combat years before. His voice dropped, calm as a drawn trigger. "She belongs to no one. Not you. Not me. No one." The clash. The first Crowder lunged. Gideon met him with the full force of a hammering fist, driving him into the gravel. The second swung a chain, metal whistling through fog. Gideon ducked, grabbed, wrenched it free, and sent the man sprawling. Rhea leapt at the third, jaws snapping, a roar of fury that had slept too long inside her chest. She hit hard, her weight driving him down, the sound of his cry sharp and raw. Silas circled, knife flashing. His breath steamed, his scar twisting as he sneered. "You think you're saving her? She'll break same as the others. I'll make sure of it." He lunged. Gideon caught his wrist, the blade inches from his ribs. The two men grappled, boots grinding sparks from gravel, muscles straining with years of rage between them. The whistle came then, distant, but growing. The train. Its thunder carried up the valley like a drumbeat of fate. Gideon twisted, forcing Silas toward the rail bed. The knife dropped, skittering against steel. Silas's eyes flicked, panic flashing for the first time. "Let go," he roared, thrashing. The train's headlights split the mist, blinding white. Its horn bellowed, a roar that drowned every shout. Gideon shoved hard. Silas stumbled backward, feet catching on the crossties. At the last second, he tore free, rolling into the gravel as the locomotive screamed past, wind flattening everything in its wake. The Crowders scattered, their shouts lost under the steel thunder. Sparks flew as the train tore down the track, carrying away the moment in fire and fury. When silence fell, only Gideon and Rhea remained standing. She pressed against him, sides heaving, her body trembling not from fear but from release. He dropped to one knee, hand resting against her shoulder. Her amber eyes met his, scar for scar, survivor to survivor. "You're free," he whispered. The pup barked once from the shadows where Karina held him safe. His voice was small, but it rang like a promise through the night. Aftermath. By dawn, the cabin was nothing but char and smoke, the land scorched but still standing. Neighbors gathered, buckets and blankets in hand, drawn by the bell that had chimed through the night. Sheriff Whitaker's cruiser sat at the edge of the road, its lights flashing faint red in the fog. Mabel Ellison stood with her lantern, her face both stern and proud. Karina cradled the pup, his tail wagging despite ash still clinging to his fur. Gideon stood in the yard with Rhea at his side, her new collar scorched but intact. Together they watched the smoke lift into the morning, leaving only sky behind. Silas Crowder and his men were gone, for now. But the tracks still gleamed, and the valley still held its secrets. Gideon looked down at the shepherd, then at the pup, then at the brass bell in his pocket. Its weight was a reminder, not just of danger but of community, of lives bound together by survival and choice. For the first time in years, he let himself believe he could belong here. Rhea leaned against his leg, her scars no longer just wounds but witness. Rain yipped once, as if agreeing. The French broad carried their silence away, rolling on toward the horizon. And Gideon, soldier no more but something steadier, whispered into the morning, "We stay." The French broad ran quiet again, its waters glinting gold beneath the slant of late autumn sun. Smoke no longer rose from Gideon's land, only the smell of fresh cedar as beams were lifted into place. The cabin was being rebuilt, stronger, broader, with neighbors' hands steadying each board. Tom Garner hauled lumber in his wagon, his shoulders set with determination. Mabel Ellison brewed coffee over a campfire, her voice barking orders as though she had commanded crews all her life. Karina tended to cuts and splinters, her medical bag slung over her shoulder as naturally as any carpenter's tool. Even Sheriff Whitaker had rolled up his sleeves, setting posts with quiet efficiency. "Can't always be law with paper," he said when Gideon glanced at him. "Sometimes law has to build with wood and nails." The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the valley, a music of labor that made the land itself seem to breathe deeper. Rhea and Ren. Rhea no longer lingered at the edge of shadow. She moved freely across the yard, her stride steady, her head held high. The blue collar gleamed bright against her sable coat. She still startled at sudden noises, but now her first instinct was not to flee, but to return to Gideon's side. Ren had grown heavier, his paws finally finding balance beneath him. He chewed Gideon's boots whenever left unwatched, dragged Mabel's scarf through the mud, and yipped at the hammering as if demanding equal credit for the work. At night, Rhea would curl near the fire, Ren tucked against her belly, their breaths mingling in the quiet. The scars across her body remained, but the tension had gone from her sleep. Where once she trembled, now she dreamed. Sarah's visit. 2 weeks later, the crunch of a small sedan's tires wound up the drive. Gideon's sister Sarah stepped out, auburn hair tied back in a loose braid, her face tired but glowing with relief. Beside her, 6-year-old Lily darted forward, clutching a stuffed rabbit by one ear. "Uncle Gideon," she cried, the words spilling out like bells. For a moment, Gideon froze. He hadn't been called that in years. Then he dropped to one knee, arms open. Lily launched herself into him, burying her face against his chest. The weight was small, but the trust was heavy. Sarah watched, eyes shining. "I told her you'd come through," she said softly. Mabel came forward, pressing a steaming mug into Sarah's hand. "He's stubborn enough to outlast most storms," she said with a half-smile. Karina crouched to show Lily the pup. Ren, delighted by his new audience, immediately tried to climb her lap, licking her face until she squealed with laughter. Rhea watched carefully from a few paces away, then stepped forward, sniffed Lily's hand, and pressed her nose gently against it. "She likes you," Gideon murmured, though his throat tightened as he said it. Lily giggled. "She's soft. And the puppy's silly." For the first time in years, Gideon felt the cold iron of loneliness loosen its hold. A community assembled. That evening, the valley gathered at the rebuilt porch. Lanterns hung from beams, fires crackled in barrels, and voices rose in unpolished song. The Crowders had vanished, their threats dissolved in the wake of the train's thunder, but their absence only made the community cling tighter. Sheriff Whitaker stood with Tom, speaking low about patrol routes. Mabel told stories that had children wide-eyed and laughing. Sarah leaned against the porch rail, her daughter curled into her side, both safe in a place that had once been only silence. Gideon sat on the step with Rhea pressed against his leg, Ren sprawled across his lap chewing the rabbit Lily had shared with him. Above, the stars broke clear of the fog, sharp and countless. Karina lowered herself beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "She's healing," she said quietly, nodding toward Rhea. "So am I," Gideon admitted. The words felt raw, but honest. Karina's hand brushed his briefly, then withdrew, but the touch lingered. The bell. Later, when the crowd drifted home and the fires burned low, Gideon lifted the brass handbell from his pocket. Its surface had dulled further from smoke and ash, but its weight was unchanged. He rang it once. The chime carried across the yard, into the valley, over the river. It was no longer a warning, nor a cry for help. It was a sound of belonging, of calling, and being answered. Rhea lifted her head at the sound, ears pricked. Ren barked once, tail slapping against Gideon's leg. Sarah and Lily turned from the porch, smiling. Karina glanced up, her eyes soft in the glow of lantern light. Gideon let the bell fall silent, but its echo lingered. For the first time since war, since loss, since silence became his armor, Gideon Hale understood what it meant to stay. Not as a soldier, not as a shadow, but as part of something alive. The river moved steady, the mountains stood watch, and in the yard of a cabin built from ashes, a marine, a shepherd, and a pup rested side by side, scarred, but unbroken.